In this video, I'm going to cover advanced world building techniques. Some methods that are very cheap or inexpensive or free, and some methods that are totally insane. The first question you need to answer is, what is the shape of your world? Do you really want to do a globe? And the reason is the globe has lots of issues, and that's what or a sphere. Or there are other shapes to consider. The simplest one is just do a flat world. It's flat. There's an edge that players could fall off. They could sail their ship go over the edge and fall off, or there be dragons, or here be dragons on the map. But what happens is that's a much easier type of world because you don't need to worry about the distortions when you measure distances that you run into with spherical coordinates. And so there's some simplicity. Do you want to just do a flat world? And we'll talk about some mapping for flat worlds because it makes perfect sense for the characters, because how large of an area are they actually going to cover? I mean, I know I've heard some discussions. I'll talk some more about it in the second half when I go about some of the insane things I've done. The other option is to do a cylindrical world. You just got a flat sheet of paper, and imagine, and you've seen this, where you go from off the left-hand edge and you come in on the right-hand edge of the map. That's an easy one. You just think of taking your piece of paper and rolling it up into a cylinder and taping it together. They could be on the inside or on the outside. It doesn't really matter, but those are considerations. For those of you who've done some old school gaming, some really old school, where you video gaming, where you've seen, I think it's some of the versions of Asteroids where you went off the left-hand edge of the map, you came in on the right-hand edge, but if you went off the top, you came in on the bottom. Now, that's not a cylinder. You've taken a cylinder and imagine you've twisted it around and connected it again and into really what it is the donut shape. It's called a torus. And you could actually have your world as a torus, and they could be on the inside or on the outside. And I remember somebody doing some of the physics of how the stars would how the sun would travel around it. But that's another interesting approach where you're just drawing on a flat sheet of paper, but you've connected the top to the bottom and the bottom and the left to the right. Makes very simple. Your distances are easy to measure. He says you can pick up a ruler and measure the distance from point A to point B as the crow flies, as the saying goes. But it's much easier than dealing with the distortions that you run into a spherical world. The other options is to take some ideas from science fiction. You've got Larry Niven's Ring World, where it's a giant ring surrounding the star, and that is massive, much more massive than any planet. It's just worked out the amount of surface area. That's a massive area. Doesn't have any of the real challenges that you have with spherical maps. Makes life much easier. You could go all the way to go to what's called a Dyson sphere, where it totally englobes the star, and that is even a much more massive world. That it's just amazingly massive amount of surface area on the inside. How night and day would work is a whole other idea, but you could do that. And there you actually get some distortions, but it's such a massive thing that you could do that. The other one is if you're talking about science fiction or fantasy, take a look at Larry Niven's integral trees, which are another interesting zero or low gravity world type scenario that is not stable, as the phrase goes. It'll only last maybe, what was it, 50 to 100,000 years or something like that. Which, okay, so it's not stable. Or the other approach, which is very simple, is I will just call it a never-ending world, where you draw a map, and if the players get toward the edge, you draw another map and add it on. You don't know how big it is. You just keep adding terrain as the characters go in that direction. And it's never ending. There's no reason to plan out more than that. Now, how do you get your maps, or how do you draw your maps on the cheap? So the first thing to think about is, I'm going to assume if you're watching this, that you can get a sheet of paper and a pencil and just draw it. At least that's the first thing you can do. Is if you want to draw up a world, draw it up on paper, things like that. Now then, if you've got access to a scanner, that's great. If not, hopefully you or a friend has got a cell phone with a camera. Go outside. This is my recommendation. Go outside where you've got lots of natural sunlight on a sunny day, and put your hand-drawn map down. Take a picture of it with your camera phone, so you've got no shadows and it's all nice, and you get a good picture. Now, the higher resolution picture you got, the better for, who's got the best camera. And take it in. Now you've got electronic copy. Now you can put it into, if you're doing with a computer, and there's a whole bunch of tools to use. I would suggest GIMP, simply because it's free. It has a lot of power, things like that. Now those are, that is almost, I don't even know how to put the price down on it. A sheet of paper and some pencils, colored pencils would be nice. Some crayons. You could draw up your map that way. And a cell phone, somebody, probably know somebody who has a cell phone. If you're watching a video on YouTube, you probably know somebody, you probably have a cell phone. So those are interesting. I like hex paper for worlds, and or hexes for worlds, because it works better in my mind than a rectangular grid or square grid, because it goes back to the old background in traditional tabletop games, like from the Avalon Hill days, if you know what I'm talking about. Some of the board games, some of the games like that, even things like Risk, if you've ever played Risk, or if you've played some of the others. But the hex type games was very common in a class of board games, military type board games, Panzer Leader, Panzer Blitz, Wooden Ships and Iron Man, Richthofen's War. Those were all fabulous Avalon Hill games, and they all used hex movement, and you get used to it. So what happened is I put in links down in the description down below. If you open it up, there's you can get hex paper. Is actually found it on Amazon, and not too expensive. I put links for two where you can print, but I'm not sure if you have access to a printer. There's some printable Hexagon paper for one place, and then there's the old Judges Guild has their hex paper too. The downside I find to the Judges Guild is that it uses too much ink. There's too much black around the border, which, just if you're really trying to be cheap, that costs money for all that ink. Whereas if you have about $9, it's $8.95. You can buy 100 sheets of Hexagon graph paper on Amazon. I like the 0.5 inch. I think the 1 inch squares are a little bit too large for drawing maps, but you can do that. Now let's talk about the insane part. And some of this is a history. I'm going to put links down below to a free tool. I actually found it. It was hard to find. The site has sort of gone away. The guy who created it, it's a tool called Wilbur, and this gets into spatial data, and the math is a little bit heavier. And there's a tool I'll talk a bit more about as I get into some of my insanities. And then I also put a link down to how to create a planet using Blender 3D and Wilbur. And it's a 40-minute video. And unless you're really into you want to create your spherical world and it's there. This is about as cheap as you can get. I mean, Blender is a wonderful package. It's got a bit of a learning curve. It's free, and I'm actually amazed at some of the things you can do with Blender. And then using Wilbur to do the terrain mapping is another thing. I'll talk about Wilbur in just a minute. Now I'm going to start talking about some of the insanity that I have done in the past. And the reason I say this is insane is if you're a novelist and you want to sit down and write a novel, you could do it really, as the phrase goes, old school, and get out a piece of vellum and a quill pen and using something like squid ink to write with, where you're taking and sharpening the quill and writing. Yeah, that's possible. I'm sure there's someone out there in the world trying to do that. But it's not the most productive method. And that's what I'm going to be talking about now. Back in 1998, shall we say, that's at least 17 years ago, I owned a copy of Campaign Cartographer, I believe it was 2 at the time, and I started drawing up my maps. And I drew up the world of Tiglath, and this was using some of their tools. You can see the map here. I'm missing a font, which is why this shows up kind of strange on the right-hand side here. But it was the original design of the world of Tiglath, and I was doing some gaming with this, and I used Campaign Cartographer to some of their ability to draw the initial layout, and then the rest of it I think I drew the rivers and everything. And I ran this campaign for a while, and my memory is fuzzy, but I ended up deciding I wanted to do a new world because of that campaign was ending, and I wanted to start a new one. So this one is what I called Lambent Steppe. And Lambent Steppe was another campaign, and I drew up this world also in Campaign Cartographer, and very early, and it was a little bit different. And one of the things that I liked about this particular world was what I'll show here was the Peninsula of Pinge. And I placed the characters, I kind of like this idea, it's sort of like Florida, and I started drawing this up, and I drew up very early on in much more detail the Peninsula of Pinge. But we're talking about world building, so it was there. So after a few years, I decided to go back to the world of Tiglath. But I liked what I'd done with all the stuff, and I wanted to move that into the world of Tiglath. So I went through, and for those of you who maybe are a bit more capable with Campaign Cartographer, I had a real hard time, but I managed to copy and paste into the world of Tiglath the Peninsula of Pinge. So I copied it from one world and put it into the other. This caused an interesting ramification, because the scale of the maps originally was the same, but to keep the scale of the world of Tiglath as I had pasted it, if I'd kept the scale, it would be much smaller, and I kind of like this scale with regard to the way it looked. The aesthetics of the world. So I ended up bumping up the scale of this planet so that it's almost twice, the diameter is almost twice that of Earth. So it's a much larger planet than there. But this is where my insanity went totally nuts. You start to see here where I had, if we zoom in a bit on some place like, let's see if I can zoom in here, I started drawing up lower levels of, and I can't remember how I did some of this. This actually may have been, no, this was an export. Okay, so we'll get into that in a minute. But what happened is I started drawing up more detailed um, maps because I was seeing some world maps that had a lot more detail in them about, particularly from satellite. And at that point in time, I got a copy of the initial fractal terrains. I think it was Fractal Terrains 1. And so I wanted to import what I had on the world of Tiglath in there and create a globe and do things like that. Sounded great, which was, then I went through a whole host of things. I drew all these levels by hand in Campaign Cartographer, and I drew this is the exporting them out. I exported them out as various layers, and I went through many contortions and ended up loading them into a program called Wilbur, which is, this is actually, I exported this from Wilbur. So the problem with this that I ran into is that you still have the contour levels become hard plateaus, and it wasn't easy to deal with. And I played with this a bit and was never really terribly happy with dealing with that. But this is where it started to get insane, because I had hand drawn all the contour levels. And I don't suggest that. There are tools to do that which make life so much easier. And from there, I ended up, this is the example where I took that map and I loaded it into Wilbur again and added, I smoothed it. I ran a bunch of smoothing functions in Wilbur, which allowed me to smooth, and you can still see some of the contour lines here, but much of them have been smoothed out and it's nowhere near as pronounced as it was. And then I added a bunch of noise to make it a little bit more, and then I loaded it back into Fractal Terrains and going with this. This is getting on obsessive compulsive, trying to play with this to load all of it back into the world. I mean, this is some of the stuff that I've done where I've exported it out as black and white and tried to flatten it. And this is insane. And I freely admit that it was insane trying to go through all of that. And this is where, but this is what I've done with my world, is that I've sit down and spent, I've roast a lot about it. It would have been much easier to just throw it away and start over, but I wanted to keep all the stuff that I became very possessive of the world that I'd created, and I wanted to keep going and adjust things and taking things from that. So there comes a time and place that you have to decide, if I'm going to start a new campaign, do I start a new world, and what do I move across and whatever. Today it's much easier because you can copy files, you can hack through them, you can make a bunch of changes. There are tools for creating that. But you can get obsessive about your world. And I know I have in the past. I've went through and spent way too much time trying to fit things in there. And there comes a time and place where you say it might be easier to just start over or ignore that. So you can get obsessive about your maps. And I know I have done that. So that's why I say it's for the insane, that you can start drawing things up. And I really suggest that to learn from the things that I have done, just go with an endless world. That's the easiest one, because it was there. I heard a blog about somebody mentioning some dungeon master who has created a world the size of Jupiter, and the people have been going through the campaign for 7 years. It sounds like a lot of fun with a 7-year campaign, but I'm going, why do I need to know how big the world is to explore it? In essence, if I do a never-ending world that it keeps going no matter which direction I go, I can do something new. And the other issue is that if you ever get tired in your world and you need something that's going on, just have a cataclysm. I mean it. In the world of Tiglath, at one point in time, I've got this continent of Lipro and the continent of Pankar, and There was they were one continent at one point in time. And actually, even if you go farther back, all four of these continents were part of one and broke up. But the idea is that there was a cataclysm which split and caused a sinking. It's the classic Atlantis scenario where something caused a great city or a great nation or an island or whatever to sink. And we know even from, if you watch any of the History Channel talking about Thera, which was a large volcano that blew up, and I think it's Mycenaean, which I get terrible at pronunciation and maybe get some facts wrong with regard to that, but they think that that's what caused the destruction. Was that we know that Krakatoa, the island basically almost went away, but Krakatoa is coming back as an island because the volcano is still growing underneath, and those type of things can make interesting effects for your world. You know, you think it's boring and stale or whatever, just add a major catastrophe that the world is split. You see this in lots of different, even video games. You see it in literature. If you Game of Thrones, if you take a look at the fall that was Valeria in there, some of the idea behind that, and how the Targaryens, why they left and came to power, and why Valerian steel is so rare. But what happens is that's the back history of that in Game of Thrones. You can add those, and your characters can be in there. I had a character, a non-player character that the party ran into, which explains some of the history because she actually was old enough to remember when she was actually changed at that point in time, which is an interesting discussion. But that you can have some things happen in your world and you can change your geography. That's why I like the electronic, because I can change it. And if you can afford it, it's that way. Even with paper, you can always swap out maps. That's the whole idea with the geomorphs. You can change your maps at any time. And players go, oh, but there's continuity in the world. No, there isn't continuity in the world. It's up to the dungeon master to whether he wants to maintain continuity. And he can say, oh, yeah, well, there was an earthquake and what was there before is now gone. And you can do that. And so what happens is make your life easier and just continue to make changes. Don't get as obsessive as I have been in the past and trying to keep things and redraw things and do things like that. Just draw it. Have fun. That's the real key. If you enjoy it, if you get into cartography, and that's fun. There are a couple of groups on Google Plus that I'm in that talk about cartography, and you can do that. But you can just do this with pencils and papers and maybe a cell phone to scan it in, or to photograph it to get it into your computer. And you can do things. You can find hex overlays to put on it and put it in with GIMP, and that way it's very cheap. But you can draw up your world, and you could go forth and adventure, as the saying goes. So go forth and create your world, create just enough to get going, and you can always become obsessive and plan on filling out the rest of it as you go. If you like my video, press the thumbs up button. I'd appreciate that. Or if this interests you, you can always subscribe to my channel. There's a button right above. I look forward to hearing some comments. Tell me what you think about this, and I'll try and reply, and we can see if I'll do some more of these. Thank you.